a river, a wharf, and a railroad. I'm Greg Holbrook. Stay tuned as we learn more about this one-of-a-kind photograph recently discovered in the museum archive. The final chapter in the colorful history of New Smyrna railroading starts right now.
This is Tracking History, the story of New Smyrna's first railroad, the Blue Spring, Orange City, and Atlantic. Once again, here's Greg Holbrook.
We're here today in Blue Spring State Park, one of the most scenic areas in all of Central Florida. Behind me is the St. Johns River and a small public boat dock. It's a reminder of a much larger dock and warehouse that were used by large river boats that sailed these waters over a century ago. This is where we begin our story of the Blue Spring, Orange City Atlantic Railroad. This area known as Blue Spring Landing is rich in history. After the Civil War, riverboat traffic on the St. Johns was a major factor in the growth of DeLand, Orange City, and Lake Helen. As tourists and homesteaders filled steamboats and headed south, farmers were using those same boats to move their produce north. It's hard to imagine how big the Florida citrus industry was back in the 1880s. Real estate investors and land speculators from the Northeast were caught up in the frenzy of easy money as they planted massive orange groves. In 1881, W. West, a prominent Orange City shop owner, saw a business opportunity for shipping citrus up the St. Johns. West built a 2-mile wooden track which connected his growing downtown to the dock at Blue Spring. By 1883, railroad developers were constructing a much longer 27-mile route to New Smyrna. This historical link, which spanned Volusia County from west to east, was completed in 1887. In 1997, Bill Dreggers of the West Volusia Historical Society hosted a program on the history of Blue Spring. In this excerpt, Bill talks about the small mule-drawn train that linked the W. West General Store on Graves Avenue with Blue Spring Landing. Dreggers also describes early photographs of the original docks, which were constructed by Louis Thursby, one of Blue Spring's early pioneer landowners.
And you can see the first docks he put in out on the river there. And this is the very earliest dock I think he had that you can see in this nice pictures here and close-up of it. And Blue Spring Landing. It's just some more pictures of the dock where the freight would come in. After the train came, they had to make little changes in it, and you see the gazebo here for this was for the passengers for the steamboat. And this is where they would gather, and the freight would be stored in this building because the train came right up to that, and they could load up. There was a turnaround for the train out just past where the present railroad track is, where this train could be turned around to head itself back, or to back down here to load its freight. These are some ladies standing out on the dock there. You can see the gazebo over here where they would wait for the train, for the steamboat, or the train, either one, I guess. And these ladies are out here getting ready to probably go up to Jacksonville to spend a couple of days up there shopping, which was very customary back in those days.
Once those early steam engines left Blue Spring Landing, the first station they would stop at is Orange City Junction. This is where the Blue Spring Orange City tracks intersected with another major railroad, the Jacksonville, Tampa, and Key West line. Orange City Junction became an important transfer point during the 1880s for passengers traveling to other parts of Florida. Eventually, railroads overtook riverboats as the primary transportation in and out of Florida. In 1895, the short line segment from Orange City Junction to Blue Spring Landing was abandoned. In 1902, the Jacksonville, Tampa, and Key West merged into the Atlantic coastline. Today, all traces of this once busy rail depot have vanished. The route is now used by Amtrak for service to DeLand and points beyond. Just east of the junction was the main Orange City station. The passenger terminal and freight house, which date back to 1891, were located here on Graves Avenue and the road we know today as 1792. The passenger terminal was located on the north side of the double track, and the freight house was lined up on the south side of this median. The passenger and freight buildings were taken down in the 1930s, shortly after the Orange City line to New Smyrna was abandoned in 1934. Once again, the increasing popularity of cars and lingering effects of the Great Depression were blamed for declining ridership on the railroad. Stopping for water in Orange City was vital for those early locomotives. The West Volusia Historical Society has a picture of Florida East Coast Steam Engine No. 9 taking on water at an area now called Dickinson Park. The park is located at East Graves and South Holly Avenue, just steps from the spot where those original passenger and freight buildings stood. Lake Helen was the next scheduled stop as trains headed east out of Orange City. The Blue Spring Orange City Atlantic Railroad came to Lake Helen in 1886. Several pictures were taken around 1920 showing the station and a nearby brick factory. Nothing of the railroad remains in Lake Helen. It is believed that Ohio Avenue, which runs through the center of town, was built on the old track bed. We've left Lake Helen and we're headed east on State Road 44 towards New Smyrna. This route roughly follows the original trackage laid down by the Blue Spring, Orange City, and Atlantic Railroad. This is an FEC engineering map from 1916 showing the locations and names of those early communities served by the train. Major stops along the way included Glencoe and the rural town of Briggsville. These names also appeared in train schedules, which were often published in the local newspaper. This particular schedule was printed in the New Smyrna Breeze back in 1890. The schedule sometimes varied between 1 and 2 daily round trips. One interesting aspect about local history is keeping track of the name changes. The old Indian Spring Station was at one time located where today we have the intersection of State Road 44 and County Road 415. Not much is known about Indian Springs. The town was platted back in 1914, and the map shows the Florida East Coast tracks running between Highway Avenue and Seminole Avenue. In the 1920s, a devastating fire destroyed Indian Springs and its post office. The town was never rebuilt. Just up the road from this spot, the town of Briggsville was being renamed to honor Lloyd Samsula, a local World War I veteran. Briggsville, with its long history of harvesting timber and turpentine, became the farming community of Samsula in the early 1920s. Other scheduled stops, such as Rogers and Twin Oaks, ceased to exist with the passage of time. The biggest name change in our story occurred back in 1887. You may have noticed that many of our photographs and historic documents refer to the Atlantic and Western Railroad. When the Blue Spring, Orange City, and Atlantic finished laying their tracks to New Smyrna, the Atlantic and Western stepped in and purchased the financially ailing business. A few short years later, in 1893, wealthy industrialist Henry Flagler came along and bought the company. By 1896, the Atlantic and Western had become an operating subsidiary of Flagler's Florida East Coast Railway. At this point in our trip, we're entering the Samsula area, which is about 7 miles outside of New Smyrna. To learn more about this historic community, let's visit with a local resident who's done a considerable amount of research on the area and its train stop. All right, well, we're here this morning in Samsula, Florida, with Marcy Galbraith. Marcy is actually a lifelong resident of this area and has had family living and farming in Samsula since the middle 1920s. Now, Marcy, you've also completed extensive research and a dissertation on the development of this farming community, how it was affected by transportation changes, and how farming affected the environment here in this area. Thanks so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Greg. It's good to be here.
Well, let's talk a little bit about where we are here. This farming community known as Samsula, we're just straight west of New Smyrna Beach, out here in the county. What's out here back after what you would call the Native American years? Who lives out in this area?
The early pioneers, I didn't find a lot of documentation on them or photographs. So it's kind of, I know it was a harsh climate. I know the environment was really challenging. There was some farming going on you see from the census, but it wasn't the kind of commercial farming that developed later.
Okay.
There was a railroad that came through here starting in 1882. So there was some transportation because there weren't any roads.
Right.
You know.
Right. And that's that Blue Spring, Orange City, and Atlantic line.
Yes.
That we're actually here talking about today.
Yes.
So those early pioneers that are here, as the railway comes through, and this area starts to develop, how does the development of the area actually come about? What are the plans?
Well, it was originally known as Briggsville. And the plans were for farming. So early on, a company called Howe and Currier bought all this acreage out here and platted it and started advertising up north for farmers to come down and farm. And this was supposed to be the ideal climate for farming. What they found was rain in Florida can be your worst enemy.
Right.
And there was a lot of flooding early on. So they developed canals. So just the same as they did down in the Everglades, they started digging these huge trenches to take the water away from the land to make it arable.
Okay, and they basically create better farmland. Who ends up coming and answering those ads and settling this land?
Well, they were advertising up north, and there were a lot of Slovenian immigrants who had started up north who ended up coming down here for the warm weather, for the perfect climate for farming. It was closer to the climate they were used to in the old country.
Okay.
So we had families like the Thomasons, the Lusners, the Sopotniks, a lot of whose descendants are still in the area today, come down and start around 1915 to start farming here.
Now, when they got here, you mentioned a name a few minutes ago, Briggsville.
Yes.
Talk to me about Briggsville. I've always known this as Samsula. Why is it called Briggsville?
Well, I was curious about that too, and what I found in one of the early newspapers from 1930, there was an interview with Newell, who was a conductor on the Orange City Blue Springs line, and he had a passenger named Myron Briggs who got on and off right up the road here around Indian Springs, and he decided to name this area Briggsville.
Well, okay. So good to be the consistent passenger, yeah?
Yes.
All right, so where we're actually standing here today, we are just off of that old railway easement that came diagonally across this intersection. There's a ditch here, a canal that we know was just on the south side of that railway line.
Yes.
As it came across. And directly behind us is a two-story house that ended up being used as the post office.
Yes.
Here in Briggsville, didn't it?
Yes.
How does that end up being the post office here?
Well, Indian Springs was like the predominant community before Briggsville really developed. They had a post office there, but they had a huge fire in 1919 that burned down most of the buildings, including the post office. So this became the post office in 1919.
Okay. So the rail line comes through here. They've got a post office. Is there a depot here for people to get on and off the train?
Didn't find any evidence of a depot, so we figure that probably the post office was where the passengers loaded and unloaded. But there was also a packing house just a short way down the road.
Okay, and I think it was just back down this line diagonally, wasn't it?
Yes.
And that railway line went right past it.
Right past it, we have a photograph that shows the rail line with all of these immigrants sitting on the landing platform.
All right.
And that's where the farmers would bring their produce and pack it up and load it on the train.
I bet this railway made life a lot easier for people that were trying to move their produce in and out of here. Once they had the packing house and they could take this into New Smyrna. It doesn't last for a long time though, does it?
No.
What happens to the rail line?
Well, the FEC purchases it in 1896, and by 1932, it's gone because of the Great Depression. So the FEC starts cutting back on its small spurs, and this was one of the ones that it cut back on.
What do the farmers do then? I mean, there's not a train going right past the packing house any longer.
Yeah, they turn to trucks. So by then there are some roads that they can use, whereas early on there weren't many roads. So by that time they're able to truck their produce in and out.
All right. Well, there's not a lot of evidence of that rail line here. We've been looking at aerial photographs for several weeks and trying to spot these different places and try to see some part of what the train that used to be.
Yeah.
Let's move to a different area and see if we can find something that looks a little more like a railway.
That sounds great.
All right. Okay, well, Marcy, we've moved to a new location, a quieter location actually.
Yes.
It's beautiful out here in the forest, but we're actually on the berm here. Let's walk down where you can see what this area is. Now, to create an actual railway berm in the 1880s, we're talking hand labor, right?
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah. None of the modern conveniences that we're used to. They had to have a bunch of guys out here cutting the palmettos, and you know what that's like with the rattlesnakes.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, clearing the trees.
And you can see these canals on both sides of this railway berm where they've basically removed soil to pile it up to get enough elevation here that you can get this track up high enough and get it out of the water.
Yeah.
And keep it dry during the rainy season. It's not real big, you know. I get up here and I look through the forest and you go, it doesn't seem as expansive as the railway lines of today.
Not what we're used to.
I've heard people refer to these old narrow gauge railways as tram lines and different things. I'm not sure in comparison how big the cars actually were on this track.
Well, Newell said that there was just one train at a time. So,
Okay.
you know, small train, but everything rode on one track. Yeah, one track. They didn't have to worry about coordinating the things because it would go and it would come back.
Okay.
Carried passengers, carried freight, carried mail. Yeah.
Wow. I know some of the old schedules that we found in the newspaper, some of them one trip a day. There was a few references to 2 round trips a day, but I'm sure 2 round trips a day all the way from Orange City, Blue Spring
Took a
to New
while.
Smyrna and back. That was probably an all-day adventure.
Yeah, and Newell had this story about if they saw a bunch of turkeys on the side, they would stop the train and get out and go hunting and then get back on the train. So
Well, that's the best way to keep on schedule, isn't it?
a lot different than our modern lifestyle.
Oh, gosh. Well, Marcy, as we walk along this old railway berm, it reminds me of an article that I actually read about the rail line, and someone referred to the Blue Springs, Orange City, and Atlantic piercing the forest to make its way to New Smyrna. And you certainly get a sense of that tunnel through the trees, if you will, of how this rail line moved across the land.
Yes. This is one of the few places where I've seen this, that you can actually envision that. You know, it's,
Right.
it's a clear shot through there.
We're not a long ways away from where you live, and I know that railway easement crosses your property as well, but it doesn't look like this anymore. There's not that clearly marked berm. What happened?
Well, people come in and do farming, you know,
Right.
and my neighbor had a sod farm, so they leveled it out to grow grass, you know. So people repurpose it as time goes on. It's been a long time since we had a train here.
I wonder if that's not what happened to the old remnants of the actual rail line itself as well. You know, I wondered if we might not find an old railroad tie or a piece of rail itself, you know, that was still left over. But by and large, besides being able to kind of see where it was, no physical evidence of the actual tracks.
Yeah.
I wonder what happened to them over the years.
I don't know. I don't know whether, you know, I know locals talked about finding, you know, the nails and things, but during the Depression, they might have repurposed those materials if the rail line didn't come in and take them back.
Thank you so much for spending some time and sharing what you know about the Samsula farming community and the old town of Briggsville. It's been a great adventure out here today.
This has been really interesting. Thank you so much.
Thank you. The next stop on our tracking history journey is Glencoe. We're here at Glencoe Road, just north of State Road 44. At one time, this quiet residential street was the center of a small community that developed west of New Smyrna in the 1800s. I'm standing on the New Smyrna pedestrian trail, which is laid out on top of the old railroad easement. Many people believe that this open area could have been the location of the Glencoe train stop. To find out more, let's visit with a researcher who has deep family ties to the Glencoe area. We're here today at the intersection of a historic railway and a historic canal, And joining us this morning is Andrew Foster, whose great-great-grandfather was the namesake for a small community referred to as Glencoe, Florida, that's set just west of New Smyrna. Welcome and thanks for joining us this morning, Andrew.
Glad to be here.
Well, let's talk about why here first off and where we are physically, where we're located. We're on the multi-use trail just off of Holland Park. The Turnbull Grand Canal is right behind us. We're here where the bridge for the multi-use trail goes over, and it's also the site of where the old bridge that serviced the railway used to go over this canal years ago as well. And so we've seen a lot of people use this multi-use trail. They've been back and forth on their bikes and walking. You think anybody has any idea of the history that they're actually walking on and riding their bikes on? The same path that the first people who came to New Smyrna by train traveled on.
I doubt it.
Yeah, probably not, huh? So we've had this conversation about this Glencoe area. Turnbull references an area west of New Smyrna that's a high sand ridge with pine trees on it. He thinks it would be ideal to put some settlers out here. We know the Sheldons, when they fled during the Civil War bombardment, talk about coming to this area west of New Smyrna to build a palm shack that they lived in for several years. Did people pick this spot because it just wasn't swamp?
Yes, there were a lot of high sand ridges, which were ideal to keep you out of the water for construction or growing of crops. It was a wonderful area.
Okay, fantastic. So your grandfather, when does he actually end up arriving here in this area?
Well, he first comes down in 1873 at the advice of his friend Reverend Selleck, who lived here in town.
Okay, so obviously his last name is Coe, yes? And it wasn't named Glencoe then.
No.
When does the town take on the name Glencoe?
Well, it's sadly after his death in 1879.
Okay.
As the railroad is approaching and being built, the idea of forming a town was the idea, and they decided to keep with the Turnbull theme and call it Glencoe.
Okay.
In honor of it and him.
Okay. All right. Well, very nice. So he comes to town with a background in mining. There's no mines in this area. What does your great-grandfather do when he arrives?
Well, on the advice of the locals, farming was a good idea. The high sand ridges were ideal for orange groving.
Okay.
So he became an orange grover and various fruit trees along with that.
Lots of other folks in the orange industry back in those days. There's no railway here in town then, though. How do they get the produce that they're raising to market?
Oh, it was usually by wagon, pulled by mules or oxen, whatever they had available. And it was a bumpy road all the way in, crossing rivers and such, just to get to New Smyrna to sell their products.
Now, unfortunately, I think your great-great-grandfather doesn't actually survive long enough to see that first railroad come to town.
Sadly, no. He died of his illness in 1879 before the railroad reaches this area.
Okay. But his sons are still in this area, living and working in this area. One of them, I think, becomes the postmaster for Glencoe, and you even shared a postcard with us where he's talking about the first train that actually arrives on these rails, and what a celebratory event it really was.
Well, that was a big day. I'm surprised they didn't have a band, but the postcard speaks of the first passenger from Glencoe to board and go on his way.
We're actually standing in one of the fairway areas for the Holland Park disc golf course, next to what we believe is one of the only remaining elements from that old Blue Spring, Orange City, and Atlantic line. But we don't think this would have been a passenger terminal, huh?
No, sir.
Where would people have gotten on and off the train?
For Glencoe, Florida, it would have been a little bit further west, possibly a half a mile at most.
Okay. Probably maybe even near Glencoe Road and the intersection of this trail. You figure they probably wouldn't have put a place for passengers too far away from that. What do you think this would have been? How would they have used this?
Well, everything I've been told in my life was that this was a service station. Basically, they had water towers here. There's wellheads on either side. And most likely they would have stored coal or firewood to recharge the engines. Yeah,
because with the old steam lines, you not only had to have water all along the line, you had to have little fuel depots as well, so you could keep those fires burning.
Yes.
Well, thanks so much for coming down today, sharing some of your family's history with us about Glencoe. I think a lot of people, they drive by that street called Main, that's there in this area, and they don't ever realize that that was actually the main street of a separate community.
Yes, it was.
From New Smyrna. But thanks so much for coming down and sharing some of your family's history and giving us all a chance to learn more about the first railway that came into New Smyrna.
No problem. Always a pleasure to come up and help.
Our Tracking History Special continues. Downtown New Smyrna Beach certainly looks different today than it did back in the late 1880s. This map is on display in our museum gallery. It was created by D.D. Rogers back in 1888, and it's the best document that we have that shows how the Blue Spring, Orange City, and Atlantic Railway came down Lytle Avenue and interacted with what was then a developing downtown New Smyrna. Some great reference points on this map: Canal Street and the Ocean House to the north, Andrews Avenue to the south, Lytle Avenue coming directly from the west to the east where it dead ends at the river at the site of today's South Causeway Bridge. Something else you don't see on this map is Henry Flagler's Florida East Coast Railway. This plat actually predates Henry Flagler's railway coming to New Smyrna. You can clearly see on the map here between Orange and Palmetto the buildings that they had to service that rail line. There's an REA Express building that would have been used for sorting mail and freight, a turntable that they would have used to spin that locomotive around to take the train back to the west, and an engine house where they would have maintained the locomotives and other components of the rail line. By the time you get just a short ways past Palmetto, you can see where they split that track into two lines so it can go on either side of the depot, which sat right between Live Oak and Magnolia on the north side of Lytle Avenue. Even a great image of that long passenger platform that ran along the south side of the depot, and passengers could interact and get on and off the train. Unfortunately, we have no photographs in our museum collection at this time of the old depot or those maintenance buildings. You can clearly see from this map, though, by the time the double line goes past Magnolia, it's coming back together. This map calls this street along the river Front Street. We know that as Riverside Drive today. And by the time the rail got to there, it was back to being a single line that would run directly out onto a wharf and a large platform in the river where steamboats would dock and load passengers and freight. Gary Luther was a New Smyrna author and historian. In his illustrated book, History of New Smyrna, Luther wrote about the coming of the railroad in 1887. The story includes a first-hand account of that momentous day from Miss R.S. Sheldon, a member of New Smyrna's pioneering Sheldon family. At the arrival of the first train, Miss Sheldon is quoted as saying,
"The countryside was covered with people who had walked, ridden horseback, in carts, buggies, and wagons for miles and miles to see that first train. Bands were playing, and people were shouting as the train came in, pulling a string of cars behind it. People shouted in joy."
I'm standing here at the edge of the Indian River, right next to the South Causeway Bridge. This is some of the most historic ground in all of New Smyrna Beach. To my north is the mysterious Coquina Foundation in Old Ford Park, and just to my south are the remnants of the old stone wharf, the cornerstone of Dr. Turnbull's 18th century British settlement. The history of this area includes Indian raids, bootleggers, and a Civil War skirmish. So it's only fitting that our story of the Blue Spring Orange City Atlantic Railroad ends right here in this very place. It was no accident that the railroad was constructed all the way to a large wharf at the shoreline. This carefully planned location was so important because of the large number of steamboats that cruised here daily. Remember, in the late 1880s, there were no trucks or interstates. Everything was moved in and out of Florida either by horse and wagon or these riverboats of all shapes and sizes. People, mail, all the necessities of daily living were brought in by water. Which brings us back to this picture, the only one of its kind in our museum collection. We don't know who snapped it or when it was taken, but we do know it represents a significant moment in time for the New Smyrna community. When those original Florida East Coast tracks were laid down back in 1893, it was considered a major milestone for this area. However, it's the Blue Spring, Orange City, and Atlantic that goes down in the history books as the first railroad to serve New Smyrna. The Blue Spring, Orange City, and Atlantic arrived on the scene a full 6 years before Flagler's Florida East Coast juggernaut. It was an impressive feat for a small, obscure railroad with the nickname built strictly on credit and air. That brings us to the end of the line in our tracking history journey. We hope you enjoyed sharing the ride with us. For the New Smyrna Museum of History, I'm Greg Holbrook.